you can imagine, to get them over here. They were not eligible for any of the bespoke schemes. What should people in that situation do?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to address the committee this morning. At the outset, I would say that our immigration system allows people to come to the United Kingdom from across the globe to visit and join family members here. And in the year ending September 2022, over 2.5 million entry clearance visas were issued. There are effectively, for the scenario that you talk about, for family members, there are there are two routes. There's the asylum family reunion route, and there is also the family immigration route, and we keep those rules under review all the time. We make adjustments in light of feedback on their operation and their impact, and we take into account the findings of the court, of course, including the Supreme Court recently, who have found on several occasions that our rules relating to family immigration, Appendix FM effectively, are lawful, do not discriminate. So there's a various routes that are open to family members of different types, and it's there are elements of discretion and exceptional circumstances that can be that are injected into any decision-making process. That's the overall scheme.
But as a child refugee, he was a refugee. He struggled to get here. There was no safe or legal route for him to do so. And as a child refugee, he couldn't sponsor his siblings.
Well, I think the position is that if it's through the asylum family reunion route, that there are avenues there for spouses and under 18 children, and very close relatives to come in. There is also a discretionary element, so that in compassionate or compelling circumstances an exception might be made. But you're right, no siblings are eligible under that scheme. On the other arm, the other limb is our family immigration rules. Again, siblings don't qualify. That's open to spouse, parents, under 18 children, the adult dependent relative that we might come to later. And again, there's an element of compassionate or compelling circumstances that does inject some discretion for particular cases.
As I say, he struggled to get here, wasn't confident. He didn't even know whether this was the country he was going to come to. He said, I wasn't aiming to come to the UK. I didn't know where I was going. I was scared for my life. So there's that issue around him not having a safe route, which was not irregular. And child refugees have no family reunion rights. I mean, that other than if discretion is applied, and we might come to that. But
may I just come back lastly, just by way of my kind of broader contextual point on the issue, is that I think that our general regime for welcoming people on humanitarian grounds is very generous. We've welcomed over 450,000 people since 2015, and it's one of the largest numbers of people who've come here fleeing conflict, persecution, seeking security and refuge in this country. I would also say that we have 100 million people who are displaced globally, and it's not feasible for all of those people who might wish to come to the UK to do so. We don't have an unlimited capacity to welcome every single person who is in a difficult situation in their home country into the UK. That is a regrettable fact of the modern world and life, but it is the right one. We do have to have a limit on our capacity in the UK to accept people who are fleeing difficult circumstances. We have country-specific safe and legal routes, and as I said, I'm very proud of the number of people who have found security and refuge in the United Kingdom thanks to those routes. We also have the UK resettlement scheme, and ultimately it's the UK government's position that people should, where possible, stay as close to their home country as they can in case the situation changes. But it will be a reality of our system that we will not be able to accept every single person who wants to come here.
I don't think any of us are quite arguing that. Can I ask you about something which is related to this that I heard about yesterday? That Afghan refugees who've come here under the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme were reassured, I'm told, during the evacuations, when many of them were separated from close family members, that they would later be reunited. I mean, the government recognised that this was important and that families should be together, and they promised, again, I'm told, that those who were airlifted to safety would be resettled with close family. It's almost 18 months since the fall of Kabul, but there seems to be no mechanism for those evacuees to be reunited with their closest family members. I'm sorry, this wasn't meant to blow a googly at you. I've just been told about it.
Oh no, thank you very much for raising it. I really, I want to see Afghan families and people from Afghanistan who have come here via our two routes relating to Operation Pitting, that's ARAP and ARCS, to have security, a high level of well-being, and a good standard of accommodation. And we're working at intense pace to ensure that people who come here through the two Afghan schemes are properly processed. There are relevant checks that need to be carried out, that they are appropriately accommodated, and that where possible, they are moved to areas in close proximity to where they have connections, family members, and where their settlement can be has the best prospects of succeeding.
As I understand this is family members who are still in Afghanistan. So the question is whether there is a mechanism in place, or at any rate being worked on, to bring them here.
Well, if it's via the two designated routes relating to Operation Pitting that I just mentioned, then their actual passage from Afghanistan to the UK is led by the MOD. And the MOD are managing the very challenging job of ensuring that Afghans who supported the UK in Afghanistan or have some connection to the UK mission in Afghanistan are properly protected, that their passage out of Afghanistan is ensured. So we're dependent on the MOD to that extent. When it comes to the processing of a visa and actually settling them in the UK, that is a Home Office responsibility. And so far we've, they are accommodated. We've got over 22,000 individuals who have arrived under ARAP, under ARCS, before, during and since Operation Pitting. Over 13,000 applications are registered on Home Office systems, with biometrics, residence permits being issued accordingly, and just over 12,000 of those applications have now been granted indefinite leave to remain. So those are the numbers. I'm quite proud of that achievement for the UK government. I think that's a large number of people who have been supported by our generosity, and we continue to support them in the right way.
I thought the ACRS was a Home Office scheme, but Baroness Kennedy, and then I'm going to move to Baroness Shackleton.
Secretary of State, I was involved in the evacuation of women judges and lawyers from Afghanistan in large numbers. Britain sadly only took a very small number of them, and I'm indebted to particularly Canada for their taking the heavy lifting here. But when there are still women judges in mortal danger. They contact me regularly, and I am told by your junior ministers that there's nothing that can be done because of this catch-22, that they have to have a biometric test done before they can get a visa. And there's no way of getting a biometric test in Afghanistan because we don't have an embassy or any place where that can be done in Afghanistan. And these are women with young children often. How are they supposed to then come here and escape the mortal danger that they're in? They're living in basements. They're in terror for their lives, and we've just seen what's happened in relation to women who are hoping to graduate. Things are getting worse for women in Afghanistan, and these are women who served us all by being judges. So what's the answer to that one?
Well, I'm not aware of that particular issue, but it strikes me that there's something logistically that's not quite working. As I said, we've had over 13,000 applications registered on our systems with their biometric residence permits being issued accordingly. So we are able to do that for people in Afghanistan or coming from Afghanistan. I'm not sure why in those particular cases that you talk about, that's not been possible. I'm not sure whether they have,
Where do they go to have the biometric testing done? What I was told by one of your ministers was, since we don't have an embassy there, then the problem is getting biometric testing done. Where can they go? Advise me and I will advise them.
Yeah, there's the way people I have to say logistically, there is an MOD operation with getting people out of Afghanistan. So I'm not on the ground and I'm not part of that program. But what I understand is that people who are moved from Afghanistan are taken to neighbouring countries and supportive countries. Pakistan is one such location where checks like that are carried out and paperwork is completed, and that's where we use our diplomatic presence there. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Just to say, either to Baroness Kennedy or to the Chair, if there are particular cases that you would like us to follow up after this session, of course, we will do so. And just to add to what the Home Secretary said, the safest route for most people in Afghanistan, depending on their particular circumstances, is to make their way to Pakistan, from which then the system that the Home Secretary described can operate.
We will have some comments about this in our inquiry report. Let me move on to Baroness Shackleton. Fiona, can you hear us? You might be on mute. The technology is wonderful until it's not. Let's see if we can come back to that question. I'll go to Baroness Primarolo.
Good morning. Good morning, Secretary. I would like to ask you a question in connection with the asylum backlog. You told the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee that you would be, and I quote, streamlining, digitising and simplifying the process of claims. Could you explain to us briefly what that involves, how long it will take, and how it will change the landscape of the applications?
Yes, thank you for the question. Again, just by way of introduction, the Prime Minister set out our broad plan last week on dealing with the challenge of illegal migration and small boats arrivals, and I think that represented a comprehensive approach on trying to make our system work better. One element of that is bearing down on our asylum backlog, and we need to improve the productivity of our caseworkers so that we can process the cases moving through the system more quickly, because ultimately we have over 100,000 people waiting for a decision from the Home Office. In some cases they are waiting for over a year, and in that interim period we are accommodating them. 40,000 or so are accommodated in hotels. That's a huge cost to the taxpayer, and so the faster we can process the people in our system, the more quickly we will be able to alleviate the pressure on asylum accommodation in our country. To address your specific question, there is a large amount of transformation that we want to embark upon when it comes to asylum caseworking and the processes related to that. We want to ensure, and I should say just for context, what I've found during my few months here at the Home Office is that we have very different practices. If you look at different, our asylum caseworking team do a great job, but their productivity, frankly, is too low. The average decision-making rate of a decision-maker per week is 1. And we need to increase that considerably. But if you look at other teams who are processing applications by people who want to come or be in this country, the decision-making rate is considerably higher. So there is a lot of variation within our decision-making processes as a whole. And I've been trying to look at what we have already in place with other visa routes, where we have digitised the application processing using our Access UK customer portal and our Atlas casework system. We need to develop, and we want to develop, new technology to build on recent improvements such as digital interviewing. We want to move away from a paper-based system. We are developing digital tools to support caseworking. So, for example, appointment booking, case prioritisation, allocation tools, a document exchange portal. We want to improve screening so that more information is captured as early as possible. And we've introduced an accelerated decision-making procedure, for example, including shorter interviews, fewer interviews, and decision templates. So there are points in the process where we can streamline, we can make our country, the guidance that caseworkers use, we can make that easier to use, we can make it shorter. We can, as I say, reduce the number of interviews, shorten the length of the interviews, digitise the interviews that are necessary. What's essential is that every case is determined on its own merits. Let me be clear and unequivocal about that, but we can definitely do better than one decision per decision maker per week.
Is that gone down? Because we were told it was 1.3.
It might be 1.3. I'm probably rounding down. It is 1.3, yeah.
Sorry, Baroness Granarolo.
Secretary, with respect, what you have just described is what everybody already knew. And you were very specific with the Commons Home Affairs Committee about the changes you would be making, not aspirations. And indeed, the Prime Minister followed that up in his statement of the 11th or the 13th of December to the House of Commons, talking about the radical re-engineering end-to-end of the process. And I think what you just said is that's an aspiration, but hasn't happened yet. You're working on it. You also said to the Home Affairs Committee in the House of Commons that it's important that caseworkers receive sufficient training. So not only are you re-engineering the system, you'll need to train all of the caseworkers to make sure that they achieve your aspirations of transparency, correct decision, timely decision making. Can you explain to us how that's going to happen? How is the training for the caseworkers alongside this aspiration for re-engineering going to happen, and when?
Well, we set the plan out last week, and we're now going to embark upon the plan. So there is an element of aspiration and ambition, and it's the right to have a plan. We want to triple the productivity of caseworkers, and we've already doubled. What we have done already is double the number of decision makers. We want to double that number again, and we want to, as I've talked about, remove some of the unnecessary bureaucratic steps. We want to shorten the interviews. We want to make the guidance more accessible. We also want to ensure that there is specialism amongst the caseworkers by nationality. We get of our backlog, we have a large cohort of people who are from Afghanistan. We have a large number of people from.
Forgive me for interrupting you, Home Secretary, because I know that your time is very precious to the committee today. But can you tell me how these caseworkers are going to be trained and by whom, so that we can move on from aspiration to actually cutting down the backlog, which I also would like to ask you some questions on. So who's doing this training? Is it in-house? Has it been outsourced? What's the time period to bring these new caseworkers into the new system that you're currently developing?
Yes, I'll hand over to the Permanent Secretary on that point.
Thank you, Home Secretary.
Thank you.
So as the Home Secretary said, Baroness Primarolo, we have already doubled the number of caseworkers, so that means we have brought in an additional over 600 caseworkers who are new, and they have required training. We have done the vast majority of the training in-house, so we take senior caseworkers and give them a proportion of their role being to train the newcomers into the system. That is what we'll be doing again as we go from just over 600 to 1,250 over the coming year. And we need to get that right. We need to model very carefully what the reduction in time that we have from those senior people, because of the training requirement, what impact that has on the total output of the asylum decision-making system. We have trialled also the more rapid caseworking in a pilot in our small hub in Leeds, where we were seeking to get caseworkers who were fully trained up to 4 decisions a week. That was in the short term successful, but we now need to keep that pace up and to spread the learning from that pilot into our other hubs, including Sheffield, and that is the stage of the plan that the Home Secretary described, which we are now in.
Thank you very much, Permanent Secretary. Could I just ask you, therefore, is that building on the plans that you announced were introduced, the new model for dealing with asylum claims on the 28th of June this year, or are we talking about a completely new system that the announcements that you made following the Nationality and Borders Act, you've put those aside in the re-engineering and doing something different now?
No, it's not a completely new system. It is an enhancement of the existing system, and as the Prime Minister set out, it is looking end to end at the totality of that system in order to make it as efficient and effective as possible. But it is not sort of throwing everything away and starting from scratch. There are some elements which will continue. There are also elements of learning, as the Home Secretary has said, from other routes, from other parts of the Home Office, where the number of decisions is significantly higher per week or per day than on asylum. Some of the reasons for the difference are sometimes to do with the complexity of the decision. It's much easier to decide that an EU citizen, for instance, is qualified for settled status than it is to decide whether or not to grant someone asylum. So clearly the case will
Okay, but the asylum
Baroness
backlog is
Primarolo, I think we've got to keep
122,000.
moving on. I'm sorry.
Okay, my apologies.
Sorry, but I'm afraid I do on this, and perhaps this is for Mr. Rycroft. We contacted the department some weeks ago asking if we could have sight of training materials. I appreciate they may be changing, and also any training that's outsourced, sight of the contract redacting the commercial points. We haven't heard on that, and it would be very helpful to us to be able to see the detail of the training. Is that something that I could ask you to take back and see what you can do about, please?
Absolutely. Sorry that you haven't received it already. I think we've got a good story to tell, both what we do in-house and the other bits, and the way that we have updated it. For instance, learning all the lessons from Windrush, for which the training elements are quite a significant part of our work. So we'll update you on all that, absolutely.
Thank you. And I think we've got Baroness Shackleton with us now.
Yes, thank you. Apologies to all of you. Before I ask the question that I need to ask, could you perhaps enlighten us on the legal advice these asylum seekers have access to? Because obviously the law is incredibly complicated and it's a very specialist area of law. And you may have your training going on in the Home Office, but what access do these people have to proper specialist advice in order to steer them and navigate them through these complex issues?
Well, Well, we're on the receiving end of people who are receiving legal advice. Are you talking about any particular cohort? Are you talking about people whose asylum cases we're processing, or Afghans, or
anybody who is applying for asylum and receives a decision they don't like, the right to appeal, specialist legal. I mean, when we were taking our evidence, and this particularly cross-referred to children, which is actually a question I'm about to ask you. There is a crossover between family law and immigration law, and there are very few people that seem to be able to specialise in both and be able to advise applicants on both areas of that law in order to assist them in their applications. And I wondered what access they are given to proper help in this respect.
Okay, well, what I would say is that anyone who receives a decision letter from the Home Office is informed of their rights on that decision letter, in that decision letter, and on the face of any decision that is issued to them from the Home Office. And that is a standard process, and that is part of our duty to ensure that members of the public or people with whom we deal are properly informed of appeal rights, if appropriate, or any routes of challenge, or any numbers and contact details at the Home Office or otherwise that they can use. I would also say that from a Home Office point of view, we're on the receiving end, and I think this year we've received tens of thousands of pre-action protocol letters. Thousands of those turn into judicial review claims. There's no shortage of lawyers out there advising individuals on action that they can take against the Home Office. So there is we have many hundreds of people working to respond to lawyers and their letters and their claims on behalf of particular claimants. And then, what I'm aware of is a large number of law firms, charity groups, support groups generally, who are working very, very actively in the sector to support claimants with any legal challenges.
And presumably legal aid is available to them.
Sorry?
Legal aid is available to them to access these rights.
If you satisfy the criteria for legal aid, you are entitled to claim it.
Thank you. Now, the question I wanted to ask is in relation to family migration. During our evidence sessions, we heard that children are treated as immigrants first and children second. If that is indeed the policy, how does that fit in, and how do you deal with the best interests of the child being dealt with satisfactorily?
Yes, well, that kind of phraseology that you use isn't a Home Office policy or a Home Office line. I think it's a quote from someone else, if I'm correct. I don't know who that is that's being quoted there.
Well, I think the question here, Secretary, is the people who apply, the children who may apply, feel they have to go through the immigration maze before they're treated as children. And is in prioritising, obviously the children's best interests in the family division are considered as paramount, but when you're making an application to stay for an asylum seeker, the immigration trumps the children's best interests. That's the evidence led us to believe that was the case.
Right. Well, there are legal duties. There is a very clear legal duty upon the Home Office to carry out our functions in a way that takes account of the need to safeguard and promote the welfare of children in the UK, and that's Section 55 of the Borders, Citizenship and Immigration Act 2009. And that's included in Appendix FM to the immigration rules, and commonly known as our family rules. You'll be very familiar with those. And that's at paragraph GN 3.1 to GN 3.3. And the published guidance for decision makers considering family cases advises them that they have to take into account as a primary consideration the best interests of any relevant child. So that same guidance also sets out that they should consider the best interests of a relevant child. So that means in practice that considerations that are relevant but not limited to include that it may well be in the child's best interest to remain with their parents where possible. If it's not possible, then that they might need to remain with a natural relative, that they need to be, you've got to consider how they're going to be financially supported, accommodating, that their well-being needs are going to be met. I'm just giving an example of the specific factors that are included in guidance which our decision makers are required by law to take into account when they're considering a case of the nature that Baroness Shackleton has talked about.
Yeah, I think what we've been hearing from witnesses is that there's a difference between that and the law, Section 55, as you say, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, between those and implementation. But
well, I would say that this is a legal duty. We take it very seriously, but going beyond that, we take the welfare of any child who's coming into contact with the Home Office incredibly seriously. Their well-being is of paramount importance. I should also say that age assessment is a relevant factor when it comes to children in the system.
I don't think we should take time going down that.
It's a relevant factor that is an operational reality for us. We have a high number of people who claim to be children, but on closer inspection don't turn out to be. So that is a relevant, a necessary factor for us to bear in mind. But Section 55 is clear.
I'll move on to Baroness Kennedy.
Thank you.
Secretary of State, I have just completed chairing an independent commission of inquiry into asylum provision in Scotland. I will press that report into your hands, and I hope that you will take the opportunity of reading it and its recommendations, because it was a very serious critique of the Home Office, I'm afraid. But one of the recommendations was that a unit independent of the Home Office be set up to determine asylum claims. And I just wondered what you thought of that. And let me explain the rationale for that, because as quickly as you can, but you will know there's a very strong feeling that there is a culture of disbelief in the Home Office, and that the starting point in dealing with asylum applicants is not to believe their account and to start from that position. And therefore the idea of tinkering with the system that you already have and having the people already in place, training new cohorts, isn't very inspiring. So what about creating something independent of the Home Office with an independent assessment taking place that isn't going to be impacted by politics or the sort of, if you like, the pressures that the Home Office comes under from the tabloid media and perhaps sections of your own political party?
Well, I would challenge the assumption actually in your question, and when the Home Office, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody in the Home Office who works incredibly hard to make these decisions, particularly in our immigration and asylum caseworking teams, which there are many, many people, and they are, and I've met many of them. And my impression is that they are incredibly sensitive to the real-life impacts of their work and the individuals that they are considering in their casework. It's not just, I really get the impression it's not just a case.
They're under great pressure to reach targets. They're under great pressure from the political cohorts at the head to reach certain outcomes. There is an antagonism towards increasing numbers of granted asylum. And so the pressure is on to keep those numbers as low as possible. And it's the reason why when cases come to the courts, there's a huge success rate, and it's not because the judges are a rollover, it's because the judges are looking at the details and reaching a decision without the pressure, the political pressure, to keep people out.
I don't think that's borne out by the numbers. I mean, the grant rate for asylum is quite high in the UK. If you look at the numbers of people applying for asylum and then being granted it, we have a very high rate of asylum grant in this country. So according to our numbers, what you're talking about isn't actually borne out.
Why not have an independent system? Why not have an independent of the Home Office system where people can be employed to assess this independently and in compliance with international law?
Well, you know, we are, the Home Office is there to discharge a public function. These decisions are a reflection of our public function, which is to control our borders. And decisions on individual immigration cases is a fundamental aspect for which, rightly, elected politicians need to be held to account. And therefore, I think there is an important connection which is necessary between political accountability and performance on our asylum cohort and strategy and policy, not individual cases. I'm not going to ever make an individual case on someone's asylum application, but our policy, of course, that must be the product of clear steers from ministers for which we have a mandate given to us by the British people through democratic processes. I think outsourcing it to an independent body which would not be held to account politically, I don't think that would be
many independent bodies ultimately are accountable to government, you know that. And so there would be a way of doing that. But it would mean that there was not the pressure of reaching targets. You're already talking about one case a week not being good enough, and that there's going to be targets to reach more than that every week. Well, that puts pressure on people to reach an easy decision, sometimes on complex cases, where what they need is more evidence. And so there's a real concern about what you're describing as a way of tinkering with the system to put more pressure on, when in fact the problems of delay is caused by your having reduced the numbers of people working inside the Home Office doing this caseworking. The numbers were really reduced. People were waiting for as long as 3 years, not able to work, suffering mental ill health. You know the problems that have flown from this.
Lena, I'm sorry. This is an interesting debate. We could probably spend an hour
all day on these individual subjects.
But yes, but I think that the Home Secretary's answered the specific question, and there are different views, clearly.
Chair, without prolonging, I do feel the need as the senior civil servant in the Home Office to defend civil servants in the Home Office.
I have a great deal of respect for the civil servants. I do not have a great deal of respect for those who are putting pressure on them to reach decisions which they are not able to do on full evidence.
Chair, I just wanted to assure the committee that all the civil servants in the Home Office take their decisions in very difficult, demanding, emotionally sensitive areas on the basis of very clear, published guidance, which sets out in a huge amount of detail for you and your members and any members of the public who are interested exactly how those decisions should be taken. So I reject any charge of political interference in that process.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Lord Ricketts. Peter.
Thank you very much, Chair, and Home Secretary, thank you, and I'm so sorry not to be with you in person. Before I come to my question, as a former ambassador in France, can I just say how glad I am to see that the relationship with the French is now working much better on the small boat crossing issue. I'm quite sure that working closely with the French, as you're doing, is the right way forward. And my question was on the adult dependent relative pathway for immigration. And the figures that we've been given for grants of settlement on that pathway show it's fallen from over 1,700 in 2011 to 0 in 2021, to 0. And several witnesses have told us that the Home Office's own examples of how to use that pathway suggest it will only be granted if a relative is no longer able to dress, eat, cook, or bathe without assistance. Could you tell us whether that is indeed the Home Office policy? And if so, doesn't it really mean that this pathway is shut? Because it must be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for people to make a long journey if they are going to satisfy those criteria I've set out.
Yes, well, the rules on adult dependent relatives aim to ensure that only those who need to be physically close to and cared for by a close relative in the UK are able to settle here. So that is a high bar. I accept that, but I think that is rightly a high bar. So those who do not have such care needs can be supported financially in the country in which they live by their relative in the UK. So basically, those most in need of care remain most likely to qualify compared to those who simply have a preference to come and live in the UK with a relative here. And that is, I think that's an important element of our rules. The lawfulness of those rules was upheld by the Court of Appeal in May 2017 in the case of Britsitz and the Secretary of Home Department. And we, I think there's an important dimension here, which is that we reformed the route for adult dependent relatives, given the significant NHS and social care costs which can be associated with these cases. The Department for Health estimated that a person living to the age of 85 costs the NHS on average around £150,000 in their lifetime, with more than 50% of that cost arising from the age of 65 onwards. And that doesn't take into account any of the social care costs met by local authorities. So grandparents and other adult relatives may visit the UK for up to 6 months on a visit visa. They can keep in touch with family members, but I believe that the way the rules are set at the moment strikes the right balance of compassion and openness, but also a pragmatic approach to the resources that we can realistically afford in these cases.
But if you set the bar so high that 0 people came through that route in 2021, and I think only single digits a couple of years before, aren't you effectively making it impossible? Because the sort of people that will qualify just simply won't be able to come to the UK. And I wonder if you would also accept the importance of well-being for children and grandchildren for being reunited with their grandparents and declare an interest as a grandparent. But there must be benefit in having family reunification of elderly relatives. And if you look, for example, at doctors, the BMA passed a resolution at their conference this year, which was strongly critical of what they call the stringent requirements. And we've had a lot of evidence of doctors leaving the NHS because they can't bring their elderly relatives here, and they move to other countries where there is a policy that allows them to do that. So is there not also a national interest at this time of crisis in the health service to be doing everything we can to keep foreign-born doctors working here by allowing them to bring healthy elderly relatives who won't be a burden on the NHS?
I'm not against families spending time together across transnational boundaries. The fact that we have cheap travel and a genuine availability for families to be reunited is a great feature of modern life. I do think we do have to have a balanced approach, and that's why taking into account the costs that bringing over an elderly relative may incur on, may impose on our National Health Service is an important factor. That doesn't stop grandparents or other elderly relatives visiting their grandchildren in the UK. As I said, you can get a visit visa for 6 months at only one time, and that's a great way for families and intergenerational relationships to be fostered and kept alive.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Okay. Lord Talakia.
Thank you. Good morning, Home Secretary. All the 3 years after the inception of the Windrush compensation scheme, only 7% of those impacted have been compensated by the losses. What target are you intending to achieve by Windrush Day 2023?
Well, I am very clear that we must compensate members of the Windrush generation and their families for the losses and the impacts that they suffered as a result of the scandal. And I've come in to the Home Office really wanting to resolve this issue once and for all and properly compensate those who have been adversely affected. I'm taking it so seriously that I've already met with Bishop Webley twice, and I've met with members of the committee because I want to work closely with them. I want to hear the needs of the communities, and I want to ensure that fundamentally a fair resolution is reached. We've made significant progress, having now paid or offered a total of more than £59.58 million in compensation. And we've continued to make improvements to the Windrush compensation scheme since our overhaul in December 2020, where the minimum payment rose from £250 to £10,000. So, keen to take any further questions, but that's my overview. It's something I really feel passionately about. I've made active efforts to listen to the representatives, and I really want to secure a good legacy for those who have been affected by this issue.
Thank you. You've been very reluctant to give the costing of the Rwanda scheme as to how much it's going to cost over the next 5 years. It would be helpful to know what sort of provision you've made financially to compensation for this particular scheme, bearing in mind that many of the people who may lose their appeal may be reluctant to go to their homeland. Are we intending to create a destitute lot of people in Rwanda?
Well, when it comes to our groundbreaking migration partnership with Rwanda, I'm very proud of what's been achieved, and I put on record my thanks and appreciation to my predecessor, Right Honourable Lady, my very honourable friend, the member for Whittam, and former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, for their foresight and their commitment to trying to solve the Channel crisis with an innovative agreement. The costing relating to the Rwanda partnership is that the UK has invested an initial £120 million into the economic development and growth of Rwanda. Funding will also be provided to support the delivery of asylum operations, accommodation and integration. And we've made a £20 million upfront payment to the Rwandan government to support initial setup costs. And I'm very pleased. I just spoke to the Foreign Affairs Minister in Rwanda on Monday, Minister Biruta, where following the judgment from the High Court, we both reconfirmed our commitment to delivering the scheme in practice as soon as possible.
Can I just add one thing to what the Home Secretary said, which is about the money for the Windrush compensation scheme, and just to assure the committee that there is no cap on the scheme, so people have, as long as they want to enter the scheme, and we will make sure that everyone who is entitled to any compensation receives everything that they are due. So there's no cap and there's no trade-off between that and any other part of the Home Office.
I hope we might have an opportunity to come back to Rwanda before we finish the meeting. But on Windrush, the specific question was about a target for Windrush Day 2023, and of the £59 million figure that the Home Secretary has referred to, I believe that deals only with just under 60% of claims which have had a final decision. So, being passionate about it, is there something specific that we can look to by the next Windrush Day?
Well, as I say, I'm very glad about the progress that we've made so far. There's still more to do. I'm also clear about that. So we've issued final decisions for more than 59% of the claims received, and we've concluded more than 43% of the claims. We also are recruiting additional caseworkers. We're directing resources to maximise performance. We want to refine the processes so that the cases can progress as quickly as possible. But over £51 million has been paid out already. Thousands of claims have been concluded. 1,900 cases have been concluded as of the end of October, and we have effectively we do still have some cases that we need to process, and we're putting more resources and improving our processes to ensure that we can resolve.
It's been going on a long time, and people are getting older, which is why we were concerned to ask about specifics. But thank you for that. Baroness Kennedy again. Facilities. Accommodation.
Yes, I wanted to raise the issue of accommodation because you mentioned the great expense of keeping people in hotels. And it's been the outsourcing of this responsibility to find accommodation for people has been a source of great concern in the inquiry that I conducted, because the welfare component of it is very, very poorly presented to the people who are needing help. Many of the people who are asylum seekers have mental health problems, and I know that you're aware of that. If you're a genuine asylum seeker, and I hate even using that term, because the majority are, and when they're applying for asylum, they've been through traumatic experiences, and being here, separated from family and so on, and going through the processes is also traumatic. The companies to which you outsource the provision of care, basically to find accommodation for people and in turn to support them, are deeply inadequate. And I just wondered whether you had really done a review of what is on offer, because people have been left without proper mental health support. The migrant helpline, we had efforts to phone it. People can be on it and be told that the number 60 in the queue. The provision of support is totally inadequate coming just now from the Home Office. And so I wondered what you had to say about the provision of support and help to people who are here, often waiting for years, unable to work. Why don't we let people work while they're applying for asylum? I'm just interested to hear what you have to say about the provision of support and help.
Well, we are accommodating 117,000 people overall who are in our asylum process. That is, we're due to spend £3.5 billion in the 22-23 financial year on accommodation and supporting that population of people. That includes £2.7 billion on accommodating asylum seekers. That's 2.3 billion on hotels, and 400 million pounds elsewhere is on other types of accommodation, like dispersed accommodation. So there is a huge amount of money that is going into accommodating a very large number of asylum seekers.
A lot of profit is made by the private companies that you're using to do that. If you look at Companies House and look at the profits that have been made by those companies, it's quite shocking that the public purse is paying out to private companies and that they're making profit from it. Why aren't you using NGOs, other sorts of bodies that are not going to be profit-making to provide the sort of support that asylum seekers need?
It's not realistic.
What's wrong with local authorities?
We've got, as I said, 100,000 people that we need to house. If you can point me to a charity that can provide 100,000 beds, I'd be very interested. There just isn't one. So the reality of the situation is that we are working very closely with local authorities through dispersed accommodation. And we have over 50,000 asylum seekers in the private rental sector. And local authorities receive funding for this accommodation of asylum seekers. That's not been sufficient. Thereafter, because we have duties to accommodate asylum seekers, and I'm not willing to let people be destitute and roaming, we have therefore had to use hotels, and we've had to manage that massive operation. For over 40,000 people are in hotel accommodation because we haven't got any extra places to put them. Therefore, there is a private sector element there. The state doesn't own an infinite number of bed space that can be deployed for this usage, unfortunately. The NGOs and the civil society and charities do not own or are able to provide us with that capacity. So we've got to produce it somewhere. If I can just finish, because it's a very important point to make. And there are lots of misassumptions that are commonly made about this. And therefore, we are using private contractors to enable the bringing on, the identification, the procuring of bed space, whether that's in hotels or via local authorities, and that is coming at a considerable cost. Yes, I don't deny that. But the alternative is to leave these people destitute.
Private contractors are making a profit out of doing this.
Lena, again, I think we've really got to...
But I would ask that the Home Secretary applies some inquiry inside the Home Office to the amount of profit that has increased over COVID with the increased use of hotels and the profit that has been made by the companies that are doing this, rather than going to not-for-profit organisations, because it's not these companies that own the properties that you're talking about. They are accessing them and then make enormous amounts of profit and have increased that profit over the last few years while the COVID crisis was taking place. And it is quite shocking, the amount of profit that is being made, and that is the choice that's being made by government to go to private enterprises that are profiteering from the asylum system that you're running.
It's not a choice, it's our duty to accommodate these people. And if you can provide me with an NGO or a not-for-profit organisation who is a viable alternative, I'd be very interested.
It's an ideological decision not to use local authorities, you know that.
Lena, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move on. I want, because we've heard what both of you have to say, can I ask you a couple of specific questions, and then Baroness Chakrabarti? You mentioned local authorities providing accommodation. They really don't have very much accommodation, as I think we'd all agree. And the private rental sector is under considerable strain. I wondered if you could acknowledge that, because it is a problem. And also, the other day in the House of Lords, as well as the holiday parks and so on, surplus military sites that you're looking at, but there was mention of cruise ships which have been are no longer in use because basically they're about to be scrapped. I think it would be helpful just to know whether that is on your cruise ships, disused cruise ships are on your list. I don't want to discuss the merits of it.
Well, you mentioned local authorities, and I do accept the point that you make about local authorities. Our primary preference is to accommodate asylum seekers via local authorities, and that's why we want to significantly boost the use of that form of accommodation. It's currently 57,000 people who are housed via local authority dispersal accommodation. We have an ambition of 100,000. That is challenging. That is incredibly difficult. We need local authority support for that. We need to actually find the properties, and that for many, many reasons, not just migration related, there are huge pressures on housing supply. So that is why we've had to go to the next option, which is hotels. And I've already spoken about that.
Why not let people work and then they could pay the rent themselves for properties?
Sorry, Helena. Yeah.
You then asked about cruise ships.
I'd like to answer that question at some point.
We want to end the use of hotels as quickly as possible because it's an unacceptable cost to the taxpayer. It's over £5 million a day on hotel use alone. And as you heard from the PM, we will bring forward a range of alternative sites, and they will include disused holiday parks, former student halls are sites, well, I should say we are looking at those sites. I wouldn't say anything's confirmed yet, but we need to bring forward thousands of places. And when you talk about vessels, I would just say, and all I can say, because we are in discussions with a wide variety of providers, that everything is still on the table and nothing is excluded.
Thank you. Baroness Chakrabarti.
Thank you, Chair. Home Secretary, I've got two short questions, two matters of public interest journalism that I want to put to you, if I may. The first is the story that broke overnight from the BBC, suggesting from emails that were made available under an FOI request that the day before you flew to Manston Detention Centre on a military aircraft, your officials were discussing the fact that people in overflow accommodation, which was detention centres, had been held for many weeks longer than was legal. And that email chain also suggests that there was some pushback and prevarication from senior people in the department, names redacted, as to how quickly to end that illegal detention. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes, I think it's really important to remember the context about the situation we were dealing with in September, in October, and then into November. On some days in September, we received a total number of arrivals of approaching 8,000 small boats arrivals. in October, there were some days in which there were over 1,000 arrivals on a single day. October the 9th, for example, we had over 1,000 people arrive. October the 29th, over 1,000 people arrive. October the 12th, 800 people arrive. So very, very large numbers were arriving. And the challenge was that, and it is an ongoing challenge, is how to accommodate those very high numbers of people arriving at the Western Jetfoil and then being processed at Manston and being moved on to alternative and more sustainable accommodation. That all depends on outflow. And outflow needs to exceed your inflow. And the reality of those several weeks was that outflow was being exceeded by the inflow because it was very difficult to procure sufficient number of beds around the country, whether that's in local authority dispersed accommodation or hotels. The pipeline of hotels was very thin, actually, and so we worked. My instructions were to work intensively to try and procure as quickly as possible hotel space and urgently. My other actions were to try and increase the capacity at Manston because we were getting very high numbers and we needed to provide suitable accommodation for those people. I then instructed General Stuart Skeets to take over the running and the operations of Manston in or around the end of September, early November, October, and we put up very urgently, I would describe it as an emergency, extra accommodation so that people would have a roof over their head and a warm bed. That was a very challenging situation. I must put on record that actually the alternative to that would have been to release people to no fixed abode into the local community. I was not willing to do that.
Thank you, Holmes. And you have at length talked about challenges and attempts to address challenges around accommodation. But as a lawyer, you will, of course, be well aware of the distinction between accommodation and detention for the purposes of the illegality that was pointed out for some time in your department. But secondly, and again very very shortly, you're also responsible for policing policy in this country at a time when there's been quite a crisis of confidence in policing. And I'm not going to get into back and forth about how we might disagree about public order, but on a specific point, in the hope of some consensus before Christmas, the Prime Minister said of Charlotte Lynch, the LBC journalist who was arrested by Hertfordshire Police and held for 5 hours in a police cell on November the 8th, he said, "It is vital journalists are able to do their job freely without restriction." So I wonder if you would consider the amendment that Baroness Boycott and I tabled to the Public Order Bill to ensure that public order police powers and police powers are never used for the primary purpose of preventing those who monitor and report on protests and on their policing.
Yes. Well, you kind of raised 2 points, and they're really important points. But just on the issue about legal alignment, just for completeness, I speak as a former lawyer and a former Attorney General. Whenever I have been presented with legal advice, whether that's verbally or in writing, I have always considered it. I attach huge weight to legal advice, and it is a factor in decisions that I make now as Home Secretary. You talked about public order. Well, I think there are real challenges. Again, we could talk about it for hours. And the sentiment, I don't know the terms of your amendment, but I will happily look at it and consider it. I think that policing protests has become more challenging for the police. I should say they do a great job when protesting has crossed the line and the criminal law has been undermined, whether there's been damage, obstruction of the highway, serious disruption, and our police are working in very challenging circumstances because some of these protesters are using more and more novel methods to get round police powers. And I think that the British public would back the police to take a robust approach. Of course, when it comes to the rights of journalists to carry out their democratic their job, frankly, in the name of freedom of speech. We need to ensure that is respected and safeguarded. And if any mistakes or errors of judgment have been made, I know that the police would be the first to put their hands up. But it's always a really difficult situation for them. We all need to strike the balance between allowing the right to protest, but also policing against what becomes serious disruption, huge levels of inconvenience to the law-abiding British majority, and fundamentally undermining public order and peace.
I'm grateful for your consideration of the amendment in due course. Thank you.
Thank you. Baroness Sanderson.
Morning, Home Secretary. I'd like to ask about modern slavery, and the government has made clear that it wants to change the Modern Slavery Act, which it says is being abused. What is perhaps a little less clear is how you intend to do that without then reducing the protections that we do have for victims of modern slavery.
Yes, thank you for raising this issue. I think that I'm very proud of the achievements led by former Prime Minister Theresa May in pioneering a world-leading and victim-focused modern slavery system in the United Kingdom. It's a heinous crime and one that the Home Office is committed to tackling. I think it's, and I don't think anyone, myself included, would want to undermine the good work that is achieved for genuine victims of modern slavery. And that is a primary concern and focus for the Home Office. What's happening, however, in recent months and years, is that the generosity and compassion, which are golden threads running through our modern slavery regime, are being abused. And they are leading to some unintended consequences that actually undermine our ability to serve the genuine victims of modern slavery, because the system's been overwhelmed by people who are gaming the system, I'm afraid to say. It's undermining our ability to secure our border, and it's undermining our ability to return people who don't have a right to the United Kingdom. So we're not scrapping our modern slavery rules, we are reforming our modern slavery regime to make it better able to support the genuine victims, but also not be vulnerable to gaming effectively. That's the aspiration in general terms.
Sorry, I should declare an interest to somebody who still works with the former Prime Minister, but I am asking this question of the committee. There's a debate that we can have, and we don't have time, about how that system is being gamed and where the proof lies for that. But I think probably the most useful thing to ask in the time available is, with new legislation coming forward, when we will then have those debates, could I ask about the progress on the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, because Dame Sarah Thornton stepped down in April of this year, and if we have got new legislation coming up, it feels quite important that if there are going to be these changes made, that scrutiny is done, and obviously without the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, I think that's quite an important component of it.
You talked about the evidence, and I just want to touch on that briefly because I think it's so important. When I say the system is being gamed, that's not just my opinion, that's backed up by the first-hand account of people on the front line working for Border Force and who are dealing with this issue directly. Dan O'Malley, our clandestine Channel Threat Commander, gave evidence to this effect at the Home Affairs Select Committee in October. Tony Smith, former Director General of Border Force, has been very emphatic on his perception of how modern slavery rules are being used to basically stay here by people who don't have a right to be here and are using modern slavery laws to stay here longer. And there are now a number of cases where we've had foreign national offenders, serious criminals who have been here for many years, sometimes decades. They have got several convictions. They've served several custodial sentences. We want to remove them, and literally generally, at the 11th hour, they will put in a claim about trafficking or modern slavery, that, you know, a common sense view must be that that is to thwart their removal. When you've got someone who's been here for 15 years and has served. So there is evidence.
I presume that the evidence will be sort of brought forward.
The point is, there is evidence. You asked about the anti-slavery commissioner, and I think it's very important that we have oversight over our modern slavery regime and our track record and our performance. Is there anything you would like to add on that?
I think we better write to the committee just with an update on exactly where we are with the appointment.
Really helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
However, I'd like to come back to the evidence. It's well known that people who have been trafficked, enslaved, exploited, tortured and so on find it very difficult to talk about these subjects. Does that not argue for more time being spent by caseworkers in interviewing those who claim that they have suffered as slaves? And given that the Home Office has, I think, accepted claims from 90% of people that they were trafficked. I understand the difference between trafficking and slavery. The Home Office has recognised that they've been trafficked. Then where is the abuse? It's a very delicate subject and it takes a lot of work by everyone concerned.
Definitely takes a lot of work, and that's why we take very seriously our duties to those people who are genuine victims of modern slavery. And I'm very proud of the support that we put in place for those people. But when you see cases of, one example here, a foreign national entered the UK in 2005 illegally, subsequently convicted for manslaughter, robbery, possession of weapons, driving offences. We finally wanted to remove him in 2019, and he claims then to be a victim of modern slavery. So I think when it comes to the timing of the claims, actually that is a relevant factor by people who want to thwart their removal. And there are lots of examples like that. We also see when it comes to people arriving here illegally on small boats, instances where we ask them on repeated occasions, are you going to claim modern slavery? Are you a victim of trafficking? They will say no, no, no. And then again, when we want to try and remove them, they will make a last-minute claim that they